Fraudulent rental applications are becoming so much harder to spot. And if you only reference a resident once every few years, how would you know what to look for now? If you're a landlord, this is one of the most important videos you can watch because referencing is no longer a box ticking exercise. It's not simply whether checking someone has a job, asking for a pay slip, or getting a nice sounding reference from the previous landlord. Referencing is now one of the biggest risk points in letting a property. And the reason is simple. Fraud has become so much more sophisticated. There's been a recent programme on TV which showed a rental property being used as a brothel. And there was a huge amount of discussion about what happened, who was responsible, how the situation had been allowed to develop. But what the programme didn't do for me or explore was how the referencing was carried out in the first place. Because for most landlords, the real protection starts before you give those keys over to the resident. It starts with asking the right questions. It starts with checking the evidence you're given. It starts with knowing whether something doesn't feel quite right. And that's where experience matters. Now, at Maxine Lester, we currently look at over 50 references a month. And that means we start to see patterns, we see repeated behaviour, we see the little tricks that might not be obvious if you only reference once every few years. Because if you've only got one property, you may probably only reference every 48 months. That's the length of the average tenancy. So if you're only referencing occasionally, I really understand how difficult it is to stay sharp. Now, you may feel awkward about asking questions. You may not spot when the story doesn't quite match the evidence. And you may not realise that something is wrong until the resident is already in the property with the keys. And by then, the risk is much greater. At the moment, we disregard 15% of those 50 applications because something isn't quite right. Now, that doesn't mean that every applicant is deliberately fraudulent. Sometimes it's just that the figures don't stack up. The information could be incomplete. The income doesn't need to, or can't be properly evidenced. And sometimes the story changes when we start to ask further questions, from referencing to meeting them. But the point is this: if something is not right, we don't ignore it, we dig deeper. Now, a recent example involved a lovely applicant whose income was supposedly going to come from business. The accountant said it was okay. On the surface, everything sounded reasonable. But we asked for further evidence, and they couldn't provide the tax returns for the last 2 years. That was a definite red flag. Because if income can't be relied on to support affordability, we know that we need to know that income is real, declared and sustainable. It's not enough for someone to say, yeah, I earn this amount, and you see that on a bank statement. The evidence has to back it up. And this is where proper referencing protects you. It protects your rent, your property, insurance position. It also protects your neighbours, and it protects you from ending up with a tenancy that becomes extremely difficult to resolve. Now, I completely understand why some landlords may think that referencing is simple. You give it to an online agency, they give you a tick or a fail. Online checks are absolutely part of the process, but referencing is not about receiving a fail or a tick. It's understanding the story behind the application. So, few tips on what we actually look for. Obviously, income. Does it make sense? Does the employment history make sense? Do the bank statements support what has been declared? Is the resident's current address consistent? Is the previous landlord's reference reliable? Is there anything unusual about the timing? Are there gaps in the information? Has the applicant avoided answering questions directly? Does the affordability work in real life, not just on paper? You look at those side of things and you start to spot the gaps. You start to see where the application needs more investigation. And that's why we don't treat referencing as admin. We treat it as risk management. For a landlord, the wrong residence can be incredibly expensive. It's not going to be about misrent. It's going to be about legal costs, damage to the property, complaints from those neighbours, problems with antisocial behaviour, insurance complications, possession delays, more importantly, stress to you. And in the worst cases, the property may be used for something completely different from what the owner believed they were agreeing to. That could mean a visit from the police. And that's why the initial meeting and application process really matter. It's not about whether somebody seems nice, and it's definitely not about getting someone to move in as quickly as possible. Of course, how someone presents themselves is relevant, but it's not enough. A charming applicant can still be a risky tenant. A confident applicant can still have information that doesn't stand up. A polite applicant can be hiding something important. So the process has to go beyond first impressions. So what do you need to have on your checklist? Well, obviously, affordability. Look at the employment. Look at the income patterns on bank statements, on open banking, not on a picture of the document. Look at the resident's circumstances. Look at whether the information provided is consistent. And importantly, ask more questions when we need to. And that's the bit that often gets missed because it's about knowing when to challenge things that aren't quite right. Because you might feel awkward about asking for more evidence. You may worry about losing that applicant. But please don't simply accept an explanation that sounds plausible. Today's rental market is that risky. The Renters' Rights Act changed the landscape for owners, and once a resident's in the property, resolving the problems can take time, evidence process, and that's why proper referencing has become one of the most valuable parts of a professional property management. Because it's far better to stop the problem before it starts than to try and deal with it after the resident has moved in. That doesn't make us suspicious of everyone, far from it. Most residents are honest, decent people who simply want a good home. But as a company, it's our responsibility to protect you, the landlord, protect the property and make sure the tenancy is set up properly right from the start. So, what should you take for this? Firstly, don't underestimate referencing. It's not a quick admin risk. It's one of your biggest protections. Second, don't rely on one document. Look at the whole application and make sure the story matches the evidence. Third, don't ignore red flags. If income cannot be evidenced properly, if information changes, if documents don't support what you've been told, stop and ask more questions. And fourth, remember that fraud is changing. The tricks are becoming more sophisticated and risks to the owner are increasing. So if you're a landlord and you're not completely confident in your referencing process, please don't leave it to chance. Why don't you speak to one of the Maxine Lester team? We can help you understand the risks, review your process, and make sure your property is properly protected from the start. And if you want more practical advice on letting your property safely and professionally, why don't you subscribe to Maxine Lester TV? We share this information freely because informed landlords make better decisions, and better decisions protect your rental property business. I look forward to talking with you.